Welcome to Ruins and Haunting Heritage. My name is Dr. April Bisa. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at Vassar College, and this is my archaeology seminar for the fall 2020 semester. In this lecture, we're going to cover the book Spooky Archaeology by Jeb Card. And it's quite the hefty book here, but it's about 300 pages of text, 274, and then another 100 plus pages of references and notes. This is an extremely well-researched book on how archaeology is in reality connected to the search and study of spooky things in general, which includes both the paranormal but also things like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster. Jeb is a friend of mine and a colleague, and I heard a lot of these stories before they got into the book, and I'm very proud of what came out of this book. So I'm excited to use this in the course. So I assigned chapters 1 through 3, which include, let me get the book for the actual titles. Number 1, chapter 1 is Time, Memory, and Myth, the Foundations of Spooky Archaeology. We've been talking about time and myth a lot, and we've been talking about how archaeology is a way of recovering and preserving memory. Chapter 2 is about supernatural relics, so these would be including the haunted objects that keep coming up in our topics, and we'll read more paper about haunted objects by Michelle Hanks later in the course. And chapter 3 is called Occulted Archaeologists. And as we've discussed a little bit before, a lot of the people who established ghost hunting were people who were trained in archaeology. And on TV today, a lot of the people who do paranormal stuff have archaeological training. So why does this kind of relationship exist? How should we understand it, and what should we do with it? So right in the beginning on page 1, Jeb points out his overall thesis that I'm going to read here because it's just so well written. I'm going to skip a couple of words for brevity, but archaeology as a field of science and scholarship, amateur or professional, is based on the principle that we can recognize and understand the material remnants of past human activities. So this is what archaeology is as science and scholarship. The promise of archaeology as a science is that through these insights, we may better understand how we can learn from the human past and past societies. He doesn't include the word but I'm going to throw in a but here. But that is not how most people have approached the archaeological record. One of the many examples that he provides after this is that abandoned buildings are thought to be the home to ghosts, mythic ancestors, and lost races. So there's the archaeology that people like me do as professionals, and we're trying to understand how people in the past dealt with things like climate change and the kind of climate change that we talk about today as far as being caused by humans, being caused by industry and things like that is not necessarily the same as the climate change that people dealt with in the past. So for example, we have cartoon movies about the Ice Age, right? There were various ice ages, and there were ice ages when humans existed, and now the Ice Age, we don't have those big, huge glaciers. In fact, our headlines are all about how the glaciers are going away. Those glaciers came in and went out in the past without industrialization. And I'm not saying that climate change today caused by humans doesn't exist, but I'm saying that people in the past had to deal with temperatures changing, levels of precipitation changing. They dealt with this and they changed and adapted. And my previous archaeology seminar was all about that. It was called Disaster Archaeology, And one of the main things that we learn from archaeology is that it's really our rootedness in place now that makes us less able to deal with fluctuations in the climate. For example, if you own a house on the beachfront and the water levels rise, what happens? If all of your wealth is tied up in that house, then you're in crisis. But if you don't have land-based wealth and the water is rising, you move your house back, right? So thinking about that, that's how archaeologists see archaeology when they are in the science and scholarship world. But that's not what the archaeology is on TV, in the media in general, the headlines in the news. So the promise of archaeology as a science is that through material remains of past people, we can learn how to be better and do better today. But the archaeology in the public sphere is about using the material remains of past people to understand whether or not monsters, spirits, and so forth exist, where they exist, and why they exist. So on page 3, he says, despite, or perhaps because of archaeology, many people now view ancient artifacts and cities as evidence of extraterrestrial visitors. Not only are these kinds of entities more than people, but less than gods, commonly associated with the archaeological, but it is possible that the archaeological has played a significant role in the development of this extra-human lore. So this disconnect of what the archaeology professors like me think we're doing and what people who aren't in archaeology as a profession think we are doing is there. It exists as a disconnect, but it's possible that the people who are doing the more scientific archaeology are actually contributing to the more mythical understandings of what archaeology is. And some people might say, well, teaching courses like this helps to create that. And I would say that teaching courses like this helps to discuss the differences, why they exist, and help us to learn both. Why can't we learn both? Why do we have to criticize one or the other? So jumping to page 7, Jeb says that Mythic Time somewhat paradoxically focuses on the present by enveloping it in a more profound past. So we talked a bit about mythical space and place with Yifu Tuan's idea that we are very centered on ourselves. So this is you as a person. And the world that you actually know from experience seems kind of boring. Not mythical, not interesting, not exciting. But right on that dotted edge of where you haven't actually experienced, then everything seems magical, or at least more magical. So it's a little bit grass is greener on the other side. It's a little bit of just our natural tendency to wonder and our natural tendency to want there to be excitement in the world. And our world that doesn't necessarily have the kind of excitement that we want to have. So that's mythical space and place. But what is mythical time? Well, mythical time is pretty much that we are focused on ourselves and all the bad things that happened in our past, that we stay up at night thinking about why did we do this and why did we do that. And our obsession with that the future is always going to be better. And how do we make the future better? And not really existing in the present very much, right? We spend tons of money on meditation apps and retreats and things so that we could just sit still and quiet and be in the present. We shouldn't have to spend money to be in the present. We should just always be in the present, but we're not. So mythical time is pretty much everything before you existed, you're not sure about. So you organize it in a way that makes sense to you, and possibly that makes the world a more interesting place to you. Some people are obsessed with living in the future, like the literal future, like I'm going to go to Mars, living in the future. Some people are obsessed with living in the past, like Victorian times, and they might have strange clothes in their closet where they dress up and pretend that they're in Victorian times, right? Some people take that further, right? Other people just play around with that every now and then. But how many of those people who envision themselves in a different time really understand what was going on in that time? For example, lots of Americans love colonial Williamsburg, and it's so beautiful, and so the colonial world was not really that beautiful. The houses weren't always cleanly painted. There was sewage running in the street, farm animals everywhere, enslaved people. It wasn't that beautiful. It's beautiful and quaint in the Disney World sense. So everything in Disney World is essentially mythical time. Like the story of Pocahontas is really a story of a child, an indigenous child, being fought over by two white men and taken away from her home and brought to another country where she dies very young. But yet we will dress our children up in Pocahontas and say that it's beautiful. So that's mythical time, right? So mythic time somewhat paradoxically focuses on the present by enveloping it in a more profound past, right? So thinking about how our need to understand where we are and when we are creates mythologies. And these don't have to be big, grand Greek and Roman mythologies. They can be your own personal mythologies. And people like to find evidence that they're right about things. So a lot of people look to archaeology to be reassured that their mythic time and place exists, such as the obsession with Stonehenge. Archaeologists know exactly what Stonehenge was. It changed over time exactly what it was. It has nothing to do with aliens or anything like that. But people want it to be more exciting, right? So let's understand that and see how that could improve the scholarship of archaeology and how that could help dialogue with people about what the world is like and why we want it to be better than it is. On page 8, he says that history inherently projects recent colonialism into the past to explain the present. And this is a really important thing to understand, that we imagine that the way things are now is how they need to be, how they should be, how they always were, such as the nuclear family in America, and that you grow up, you move away, you get a job, right? That sort of world is created by the colonialism that created the United States. There's a whole other ways of living that don't include that. But when we're confronted by a site, an object, a history that doesn't fit in with that idea of how the world has to be, it starts to generate this idea of mythical time and space to us, of other worlds, instead of that the way that we live today has its own history, not that it had to be that way. On page 8, he says that colonized people become symbols of unchanging primitive past. And if they deviate from this unchanging past, they may be considered inauthentic. So this is a lot of the stories and the misunderstandings about indigenous people and about people from non-Western cultures, that everybody who is non-Western is considered exotic, partially because you can't understand how they fit into the colonial story, that this is the way things have to be. So why didn't those people become what people who portrayed and benefited from colonialism became? Well, it must be because of spirits or supernatural stuff and so forth. Page 9, he says, it's no coincidence that real-world ghost stories also limit themselves to the relatively recent past. Ghost stories typically reach back at most a few hundred years. The trope of native burial grounds is the alleged exception that proves this rule. But native burial grounds are about colonialism, so they are also about the recent past. So in Michelle Hanks's book, we talked about how all the ghost stories ever written in literature, 70% of them are from the English tradition. So thinking about how ghost stories aren't about 5,000 years ago. Ghost stories aren't usually about 500 years ago. Ghost stories are usually about those people who are inside that kind of dashed line section of, you understand this, you understand this a little less, this is a little less, this is a little less, as you go further from the center of who you are and what your experience is. And that's where the ghost stories exist. They're at the boundary of what you know and understand and what you don't know and understand. On page 11, Jeb says, the dangerous or transgressive supernatural aspect of archaeology is the most persistent and popular representation of the profession in fiction. So whereas most people have their mythical time and places, and they're wandering around the world and living their lives, and they have whatever beliefs and stories they have, and they're usually pretty happy about it, archaeologists are poking at that. They themselves are basically time travelers in that they put themselves in a site that was from 5,000 years ago. Then they take themselves out and they put themselves in another site that was from 500 years ago, and they take that out. And that's in a lot of the stories of ghosts and the supernatural that include archaeologists. Archaeologists cause there to be curses that are unleashed. They cause the earthquakes, they cause problems, because the idea is you're not supposed to poke at mythical time and mythical place. You're not supposed to know about the past in a more real way. You're not supposed to touch it. On page 26, he says, as early as the 17th century, fairies were becoming a symbol of a simpler pre-modern time. So this idea that there are things, especially in the woods, that are mythical beings that are usually dancing around, having a good time. They don't really have worries, but sometimes fairies can suddenly become evil, right? Especially if somebody is going to go into their woods. So Jeb looked at all of the literature of when fairies are documented and discussed, and he found that there's a simpler time that people are suddenly craving once things become much more complicated. So this harkens back to our Harrison and Schofield book, After Modernity, that a lot of ghost stories are about, is this fast-paced life making sense? Let's stop, let's slow down, let's think about what we have lost and who we have lost. But as I said earlier, he doesn't limit himself to that sort of paranormal. On page 27, he said, would-be monster hunters uncritically appropriate convenient parts of legends of water or forest spirits to create flesh and blood creatures like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster, ignoring supernatural or contradictory elements of these legends. So he sees that when people start talking about fairies in the woods, they then start talking about Bigfoot. They then start talking about the Loch Ness Monster. And these ideas get interwoven where you could see similarities throughout, but you also see contradictions in them. On page 28, he's talking about a specific person. He says, Machen's haunted rural landscape mirrored his antipathy toward industrial society, secularism, and the disenchantment caused by science. So in the past, when we didn't have all of this industrialization and all of this science, people lived on the land, in the land, closer to the land. And haunted rural landscapes generally harken back to that time. So it's a critique of, why do we have to go to school until we're 35 and then have a career and then try to pay off all of our student loans before we have to retire, and then we don't have any retirement money, right? That kind of rat race of the current way of life compared to you wake up as a child on your family's farm and you inherit your family's farm and you'll work on your family's farm. But what we lose when we harken back to that time is understanding how hard it was to have a family farm and to work on a family farm, and to have that as your only security, especially if there was a drought or a flood or so forth. So these stories are playing with these alternate ways of life that we all have in this mythical sense of time and place. From bottom page 42 to the top of page 43, he gets back to the native burial ground. The trope of the native burial ground is deeply embedded in colonialism and is part of the larger myth of the vanishing native and the extinction of indigenous people. Colonial writings of unknown authenticity describe how in the first year the Puritans colonized Plymouth. The sachem, or leader of the Passengenset, protested against English grave robbing for pottery and other goods by invoking his mother's ghost, who appeared to him in a dream. The sachem's speech became a persistent motif in colonial and early Republic American literature, setting a standard for describing indigenous Americans as spirits, demons, and ghosts. However, haunting may be more broadly associated with British colonialism globally, and the phenomenon of haunting is intimately tied to the transformations of landscapes in Europe. So here, when the first Puritans came to Plymouth, they were starving. They didn't have much. They were digging into native graves to get things like corn, to get things like pottery, and the indigenous people wanted them to stop. So they basically said that, you're going to be haunted. The spirits of my ancestors are going to have revenge on you. And then that enters into the colonial stories that ghosts inhabit native burial grounds. Right? Whether these are paranormal ghosts or ghosts of place, or they're ghosts as ancestral beings, it's never really discussed in any of these stories. But they serve that purpose that, you should be thinking about the people who are in the burial grounds, and you shouldn't be stealing from the dead. So the ghosts, in essence, are ghosts that are trying to teach proper behavior here. On page 43, he says, the sympathetic nature of the haunted native burial ground, that such places victimize white intruders, becomes both a form of appropriation of indigenous identity and oppression, and a convenient way of mythologizing the landscape. So spaces become places when stories are told. And if you could say, over there's a native burial ground and it's haunted, then the landscape has more meaning. Wherever I live, and I've moved around a lot in my life, local people always seem to know where there's native burial grounds, even though there's no markers or anything. And is it because of the stories that have been told, or is it because they actually know? So thinking about how in America, at least, the native burial ground is part of local history. So there's lots and lots of interesting stuff in this section, and I'm really doing a disservice to Jeb and his book by skipping over the really great stories. So I'm just pulling out kind of the factoids, but make sure you get the great stories in there. And he talks about things that, really are close to me, as far as he talks about Amityville and the Amityville Horror House for the movie stories, and the real life, what happened there. And that's near where I grew up on Long Island in New York. And he also mentions the Shinnecock, who is the native group, the fairly recognized tribe on the end of Long Island in Southampton. So on page 44, he says, the reassertion of indigenous agency inverts the haunted status of indigenous places. So that's where, in a more scholarship sense of archaeology, studying this hauntedness is part of studying indigenous past and present, and part of understanding how archaeology works in the world. So if through archaeology we could reassert indigenous agency, then it takes that haunted place, this burial ground, and it inverts it in that the burial ground's not the bad place. Those Puritans who kept digging into the graves, those are the bad people, right? So it's just the hauntingness is to protect their own place. So skipping to chapter 3 here, the chapter on occulted archaeologists, Jeb talks about his own travels. He went to all these kinds of haunted places and tried to understand how people were interacting with it, but also what it meant from a scholarship point of view, not just a popular point of view. He says on page 47, in June of 2015, I accompanied a tour group to Stonehenge, Avebury, and other tourist sites in the Wiltshire area of England. Both the pre-recorded narration and the tour guide significantly featured paranormal elements alongside archaeological information. Paranormal topics were not an advertised aspect of the tour, but were not questioned by the guests. So this is an example that most people expect archaeology and the paranormal to be together. You don't question that. On page 48, he says, if archaeological remains commonly gain supernatural and spiritual qualities, we should not be surprised that archaeologists would participate in occult practices and have occult beliefs. So if the popular public is sure that archaeology and paranormal stuff goes together, why wouldn't we expect archaeologists to teach courses called Ruins and Haunted Heritage, right? Why would we expect there to be this separation? On page 59 to 60, he talks about Hans Holder, who is one of the people who formalized ghost hunting. And Hans had a college education in archaeology. Holder claimed that he introduced psychometry to archaeology in 1967, and that the technique became a legitimate adjunct of archaeology. But the notion of psychometry, the ability to gain information physically from objects, emerged with spiritualism in the mid-19th century and became a staple of theosophy. Holder described using the technique with various psychics to solve crimes, investigate haunted houses, and read archaeological sites. So Holder thought that you could hold an artifact at an archaeological site and feel the spirits that are in it, and therefore that would tell you what the archaeology site is about. And that never became a legitimate adjunct of archaeology. But if we think about phenomenology and how archaeologists are trying to understand the feelings of places, right? Maybe the phenomenology, along with the thingness of that object, along with the knowledge that we have, we kind of in our minds pull the story out of the object, that it's not innate in the object as a paranormal sense. So think about that a bit and play around with that idea that where is the line between the object being a haunted object and resonating an energy to you that makes you understand it in a paranormal sense, and the object being a object from the past that has qualities that you could analyze from that object, and from your knowledge of cultures and the past, pull out that sort of information, along with your understanding of the phenomenology of the landscape and how that all kind of has meaning together. He says on page 61 that Stukely and his friend Sir Isaac Newton both suspected that the ancient builders of Stonehenge had special sacred wisdom about the nature of the universe and represented divine knowledge with their circular temple. So here, another archaeologist, Stukely, is invoking a pure scientist, Sir Isaac Newton, to say, like, see, other scientists think that there is some sort of ancient wisdom here and some sort of spiritualness insights like Stonehenge. On page 64, Jeb says, others believe in the stone tape notion that physical objects acquire a psychic or electromagnetic residue. And the phrase derives from the 1972 television film The Stone Tape, which features archaeological imagery and is likely based on the writings of T.C. Lethbridge. Moving a little further down the page, Lethbridge participated in the birth of an independent alternative archaeology with a disdain for academia and bureaucracy, a scientification of the supernatural into the paranormal, and an emphasis on the physicality and personal adventure and experience over contextualized research. This new style successfully appropriated the symbols of archaeology and in many ways overshadowed professional archaeology. So Lethbridge, again, had training in archaeology, and he was trying to use the sense of archaeology as exploration and adventure and investigation into the past, but he didn't want academia, he didn't want bureaucracy, he didn't want it to be science. He wanted it to be fun and exciting. So he created this idea that is really about the haunted objects, the stone tape theory, that if something bad happens next to an object, that object would inherit essentially a memory of that event, and it could replay it to people upon touching it. So there's so much great stuff in this book, but I can't go through it all. I'll tell you that Jeb Card has several different podcasts. He's part of the Monster Talk series. He's part of In Research Of, which is a section of the Monster Talk podcast. He used to be a co-host of the podcast Archaeology Fantasies. He loves talking about this stuff, and if you love podcasts, try to find Jeb Card and his podcast, and you'll learn a whole lot more. But he does talk a lot about haunted houses and the information that we need for understanding haunted houses further on in the book. So if that's something you're excited about, I really encourage you to get a copy of this book and read the entire thing.